This video is on mnemonics, and we're primarily going to focus on visual mnemonics, but we're going to cover all three types. And you may be thinking, well, there's five senses, so why aren't you talking about taste? Why aren't you talking about smell? The reason why is because nobody really uses those. We have a very limited vocabulary, and our culture just doesn't focus on those things. So if you were living in a culture where taste and there was a lot of vocabulary about taste, it was really important for you to understand the distinctions, and there was a whole system of understanding about it, then you could use those. But because they're not, and it's just too unconscious. For example, your nose and your sense of smell is the only sense that bypasses your brain. The higher order functioning of your brain goes immediately to kind of your emotional centers. It's the only one because it's so ancient. It's one of the oldest systems of sensing in our body. So these are the three main ones, and visual is by far the primary, especially in our culture that's more visual. There's other cultures that are more auditory. For example, if you ever listen to the readings of certain religious texts where they're basically half spoken, half sung, like reading the Torah or reading the Quran, those languages are more melodic. They have more of a structure of sound, and it's not and singing aspect to them, not just the spoken words and the more the written aspect. And you even look at the characters themselves; they've got a lot more style than our Western 26 letter alphabet. So different cultures also have different. We'll be getting more into that. But these are the basic three. Visuals, which is about shapes. It's also about 3D environments. Auditory is about sounds and words and repetition. And then body is mostly about dance, but really any way of configuring your body. Eventually you're going to form a muscle memory around that. And so they all have different uses, and they've also been used in different situations throughout history. So YMCA dance is the one that I immediately thought of most. I also briefly took a African dance class when I was at college, and what was really interesting to me is the dance traditions. And I've seen this a little bit in like rap or hip hop music videos where it's like the Soldier Boy dance and stuff like that, where it's just these rappers and also female singers just seem to have more of a culture. African American dancers and singers just seem to have more of a culture and just seem to be better at dancing than our white culture. So it's just it's an interest. Like, I always kind of noticed that, but once I took this African dance class, what I learned is that in certain cultures in Africa, there's these traditions where as you go through different stages of life, it's a rite of passage to learn a certain dance, and there's a lot of communal dancing and singing that goes on. And so that's just not part of white culture as much. It's not part of in America. It was certainly not a part of my family. And so I learned a lot from that class, and I thought that was really interesting. So that's part of something that exists in certain cultures in the world, not as much in other cultures. And it's a way of memorizing things. So these dances have evolved over hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they have a lot of meanings to them. This also, there's a rich culture in India of dancing, and a lot of this stuff also relates to religious practices. So a lot of the ideas within a religion will be memorized through songs and through dances. And so it's really interesting to see how that happens. And a lot of memorization throughout history has been about memorizing religious texts. One, because it was really expensive to distribute books, and second, because memorization was just much more valued, and it wasn't easy to access. Like, you couldn't just search something on your phone or look through some library or go on Google and look something up. So it was just very expensive, and so you had to memorize things or else you really couldn't hang on to them. Part of the problem with memorizing things with your body is that for most of us, we have a very small vocabulary of movements, and we don't really think consciously about how we move. It's mostly whoever we live around, whoever we grow up with, our family, who our friends are, those are the movements we learn. And I talk about this more in my public speaking course about how to learn a greater vocabulary of movements and what movements mean. Also my body language course, understanding what different movements mean and understand how to expand your vocabulary. A lot of people have extremely limited vocabularies in how they move their body and how they express themselves. So it's important to learn how all of these things work, and also learning how to dance is really interesting. I started learning how to dance salsa and bachata a little bit a few years ago, and part of what was interesting to me is understanding how it's a language, and moving your body in different ways according to the music, and even music is a language, and understanding these languages and starting out with just knowing a few moves and feeling so limited by that. So there's a lot more that goes into memorizing things and understanding these languages, these kind of sign languages of how you use your body. But if you want to learn more about that, check out my other courses. It's not really something that's very useful for memorizing things. Some people like to do things with their body, and even tattoos. A lot of people that get tattoos, they want to remember something. So they get that tattoo so they'll always remember something. Some people get stuff like on the inside of their wrist, and so like when they wake up every morning, they look at it so it's always there. They want to remember somebody who died or somebody who was very important to them, or an important quote that they heard that always reminded them of something. So that's another way to do things, is actually mark up your body with the different things you want to remember. Another way though is on different parts of your body, like the different knuckles on your fingers. You could associate and kind of have each of those be an anchor, something where you attach something important and kind of store a different memory on each of those parts of your body. So any distinct part of your body, you could theoretically attach a different piece of information to that. You could even write things on your hand or write things on the outside of your hand, and over time just let that ink disappear over maybe a few days or a week, but those ideas stay there. So that's another thing you could do. You could also use different colors. So there's different things that you can do with your body, but it's not a powerful way. It doesn't scale very well. So we're not going to focus on that too much more. Auditory does scale a little bit better than using your body. So a lot of people that memorize the Quran or memorize the Torah and have to memorize a huge amount of information, and that becomes one of the strengths of the language. So when children a lot of times are the ones who are learning to memorize either parts of the Quran or the entire Quran, is part of what makes it easy to memorize is that it's kind of a song. It's kind of halfway between words and a song, and also because of the language of Arabic and how different words are structured, it's like there's this root part of the word that means the same thing. Like it'll mean book, or it means something about a library or learning, and so any word related to books will have that same root of two consonants, and so the same sound will be in all those different words. So it creates this language that has a melodic quality to it also, and just has a more regular structure that's more suited for music. So and so memorizing things using a certain language will be easier than memorizing it in another language. There are also things like rhyming or acrostics, where it's like creating an acronym for something, and you can memorize stuff in that way. That also doesn't really scale. You can't have 30-40 letter words and just memorize tons of stuff that way. So these are usually good strategies for when you want to remember something in a linear format. It's not and also, like, what happens when you can memorize stuff with this auditory, where you're just repeating it over and over, it becomes kind of a song or a track, is I've memorized speeches this way. And what happens is you're only remembering it along the single track. So it's hard to jump in at a certain period of time. It's almost impossible to go backwards. So it's not a very flexible system. It's pretty close to an audio tape running in your head once you get the repetitions down good enough. So there's certain uses for it. I talk about that more in my public speaking course, but it's not necessarily a great way to actually understand a framework or a system. What you can find yourself doing is having something in your head that you can spout off, but not actually understand it and not be able to process its underlying meaning, underlying structure. So you can fool yourself into thinking that you really understand something because you have perfect recall, but it's not the actual type of recall or the type of deeper understanding that you need. Once you have that deeper understanding, you don't necessarily need this sort of perfect recall. And even if you do, it's going to be easier to have it. So this was also stuff with poetry, why there were fixed meters for poetry, because you needed that sort of consistent pattern to be able to memorize a long story like the Aeneid or the Odyssey. That's what these bards would be doing. They'd be spreading it out and telling different people the stories because they had to hold the entire story inside their head. And it was only when somebody finally wrote it down that it becomes standardized. But these different bards would all be telling slightly different versions of the story, different pieces, mixing and mingling things. And so that's how a lot of information spread until the evolution of the written word, because things were always being changed, adapted, doing innovation, improving things. And to a certain extent, that stopped with the written word. This is the big kahuna, visuals. So humans and animals, we naturally memorize locations. We naturally memorize objects. And what we don't usually do is turn information into images. But we do this for logos. We do this for signs on the roads. And we do it for things like when you open up your iPhone, you see an icon for each app. Or you open up your laptop and you see an icon for each app. Also, where did our alphabet come from? It originally came from these little pictograms, these little pictures, like line drawings, and then over time they simplified and they turned into the alphabet that we use today. So the innovation here is that you can turn information back into objects, back into images, and then place these in a virtual environment. So you can just, and also, let's say you're taking a test in a certain classroom, you can memorize, you're sitting in that classroom every day, you can memorize the exact location of everything in that classroom and then attach the answers that you're going to need for a test or attach the information you're going to need to those different objects. And you can literally look around and then those things will pop into your head. So it's really first understanding this language of how to turn ideas into objects or images very quickly, which is basically just understanding how symbols are created, how to create your own symbols, and also just practicing. So this is the kind of thing where just practicing you get faster and faster. When you first start, it might take 10 or 20 seconds or even a minute or two to think of a good image. Over time, it becomes something where it's basically instant. It may not be the best idea in the world, but you get something that's workable very, very quickly. Within a second, 2 seconds, sometimes just instantly something will pop up to you. So part of what happens is you start looking at the words you already understand and starting to think about the picture that they're associated with. And anytime you see an icon or you see an object, you just start to create more connections to, okay, what could this represent? You also listen to music and watch movies a little bit differently. So you start to look for the metaphors. You start to look for, okay, this object can actually represent something like love. So on Valentine's Day, when you're seeing all these hearts everywhere, you're seeing Cupid flying around, those are images that represent this abstract idea of love. So you may be thinking, well, what is love? What is it about the heart? And even emotions. So the idea of emotions existing within the heart. You may think, well, that's obvious, that's like everybody knows that, but it turns out in other cultures they have different metaphors that they use for understanding emotions, and they may seem very weird when you're first learning about these things, because it's like you store emotions in your head or you store emotions in your hand, or you can like transform emotions by like putting stuff in a fire or drinking something or doing whatever. So different cultures have different metaphors they use, and if you've never spent a lot of time in other cultures, I really like watching documentaries so I can expose myself to these different ways of looking at things. but you start to learn and look at those symbols. And once you understand those symbols and you pay more attention to them, it becomes pretty obvious. Another great way is just look at advertisements, because they're always using symbols, and symbols are really powerful. Check out stuff like The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. A lot of this stuff is talking about those deep symbols. Carl Jung, when he was talking about the unconscious and all the symbols that play into that, we kind of process these symbols sometimes even without fully thinking about them. That's part of the power